Now, the reason this is interesting in the context of leadership in the 21st century is that you tend to think of leadership coming from technology or economic power or military power or something like that, which is what we have experienced all along. But I honestly believe that in the 21st century, it's coming from the power of ideas. And if you look at nationalism and the nationalist discourse, it's one of the most powerful ideas out there. And the reason I say that is because we have seen a number of civilizations rise in the recent past, or I shouldn't say civilizations, number of countries rise in the last 100, 200 years. One is the rise of America, the other is the rise of China. And if you look at them, what you see is that there is a Protestant grand narrative that the Americans have taken full advantage of. And then there is a Confucian grand narrative that the Chinese have taken advantage of. So along the same lines, there is, or at least there is the glimpse, there are the glimpses of an Indic grand narrative. And that's what I tend to think of in terms of the big idea that the nationalist narrative brings to you. But there are also a couple of other things. One is, some of you may be aware of Professor C.K. Prahlad, the great management theorist. He had this concept of a strategic intent, which meant this is the long-term vision that a company or a country or even an individual has, which helps them focus like a laser beam on that particular objective. And it's a very maybe quantitative, maybe qualitative, but very well-defined objective. And that's what the nationalist discourse, in my opinion, brings to us, partly because we were able to bring ourselves to independence through a nationalist discourse. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. A lot of it, I think, is related to the idea, somebody mentioned it earlier, I think, I forgot who it was, but talked about Indic exceptionalism. Because the Americans think they're exceptional. The Confucians think they're exceptional. In fact, we are exceptional. And the reason I say that is because, personally, I came upon the idea of Indic nationalism while I was living in the US. I was there for a long time. And over time, I realized that there is something really attractive in India. And that's what kept our civilization going. And if you dig a little bit deeper, what you find is that it's an Indic idea. So it's that idea, the power of that national idea, that I tend to think of as the nationalist discourse. But what we're going to do here in this panel is we're going to basically divide it into three sections or three sub-themes. The first sub-theme is, I have given my definition, if you will, rather vague definition of nationalism, but our panel will discuss what the nationalist discourse is according to their lights. That's the first sub-theme. The second sub-theme is, how is this going to help us in the international arena, where you have a number of other nationalist sub-themes, for example, or nationalist themes. For example, Trump or Putin or Xi or Abe, all of these leaders are now articulating nationalist discourses of their own. So how does ours help us in addressing or getting a leadership position in the international arena? So that's another theme. The third theme is, conversely, how does this nationalist discourse help us internally? Because we may have multiple discourses, multiple narratives in India. There is a Hindu narrative, possibly a Hindutva narrative that's different. There is an Ummah narrative. There is a church narrative. There are a bunch of narratives. So where does the nationalist narrative, nationalist discourse fit into that? So this is roughly the plan that we have. And let me also iterate once more the idea that you should have your app on your Android phone, and using that you can send questions to us. So without further ado, let me now jump into the first theme of defining the nationalist discourse. And may I also invite Mr. Vivek Agnihotri to please join us on stage. So let me start with you, Zaresh. Why don't you give us your idea of the national discourse, and I'll sit down.
See, my idea of nationalism or being nationalist is devoid of religious identity. I mean, I am Indian and I am a Muslim or I am a Hindu, but that Indian identity is the most important, because wherever you go as a Muslim, like for example you go to Saudi Arabia, they identify you as Indian. So that Indianness or the nationalist identity has to be devoid of any religion, that subtext. But for me, it is beyond sloganeering. For example, in India we have a very big problem of very small things like paying taxes. You know, we are a country of 1.3 billion and the taxpayer in the country is less than 2% or 3%. Recently now we have come up, when GST thing happened, there was a uproar against GST from some quarters, or rather from a very large quarter, and I come from Gujarat. And I know for last several years that a big section of our society thinks paying tax is a crime, but they have an identity of being Indian. So that, following the laws of the country, the law of the land, with the income tax, with the taxes, with full stop of what the government says or does, that nationalistic character we have not been able to establish in the country. As you were mentioning about the Germans, about the Japanese, or about the Americans, they have that German character is there, which we don't have. And rather, we have moved further, like we are more a Gujarati, we are a Maharashtrian, we are a Kannadiga. That Indianness comes second. And the political class also now in several states, for example, also is now talking of, like for example, we have in Karnataka, that you should have a constitution of Karnataka or something like that, a Karnataka flag. So I think Indianness, being Indian without any religion, is my idea of being a nationalist.
I think we often conflate patriotism with nationalism. They are not necessarily exclusive of each other, but they are not one and the same. You can be a patriot without being a nationalist. And if you are a nationalist, you are also a patriot. So when we think in terms of paying taxes, living by the rule book, following the law of the land, that's more out of a sense of patriotic duty. Nationalism stems from the idea, from the whole idea of identity, and that identity flows from the concept of nation. So you have a nation, you have a national identity, and if you are conscious of that national identity and you want to preserve it, you want to conserve it, and you want to use that as the springboard of doing various things, and then that becomes nationalism. Sadly, what has happened is that we have reduced the idea of nation to the geographical reality of nation states. So what we have for the geographical boundary or map of India is not really the nation of India. The nation of India is much bigger. And the civilizational boundary of the Indian nation goes way beyond the political boundaries of India. And that sort of defines who we are, because our identity is also civilizational. But where we move away from the European idea of nationalism is because they first had to invent nations and they had to then invent national identities, And then they had to beat up nationalism to to legitimize the nation states which they invented. It doesn't quite work over here. This whole thing about religion as a criteria, again, is a European sort of a concept, because over there it was, they had very little civilizational identity to draw from. So it became more a community identity, and the community identity was, of course, also anchored in your religious identity. In India, that would not really be true, because here if those of us who have read Hindutva, the treatise of Savarkar, the idea of Indianness is not the same as the idea of Hinduness. Again, it is not mutually exclusive, but they are not one and the same. So we can keep religion aside while talking about nationalism in India. A couple of other points which need to be touched upon is that nationalism in the 19th century, 20th century, and then 21st century. Today, if you look at the Indian nation exists at three levels. You have the political reality of the Indian nation state, and then you have the civilizational boundaries of the Indian nation state, but you also have the diaspora. So you have the Indian diaspora, which is spread all over the world, and most of them have not given up their sense of who they are. So that identity still remains, and then what we are seeing increasingly is the rising tide of long distance nationalism. So which somebody described as H1B nationalism. So you may go from India to America to be in the Silicon Valley, but you would still identify yourself as an Indian. You would want to be seen as an Indian national, and you would want to wave the flag. So perhaps we then need to reconsider or reconfigure the whole idea of nationalism in the 21st century, in which there will be space for the indigenous Indian nationalist, there would be space for the global Indian nationalist, and there would be space for people who primarily view their identity as an Indian identity, which they do not want to give up or dilute. Linked to that, the last point which I would like to make is that in our previous session, there was a reference to President Trump's slogan of making America great again and America first. But nationalism rests on the idea of national interest. So in India, we would say India first. In fact, Mr. Modi's slogan was India first. So this whole revival, if you look at the disruption which has happened across the world, begins with Mr. Modi's ascendance, and then the others follow. And there has to be a competition of identities. That is a reality, and which you cannot ignore. So there will be India first, there will be America first, there will be Britain first, Germany first, Japan first, Russia first. And that's how the jostling will happen. And China, of course, will push its envelope to become China first. A last point which I think we need to also consider is this. There is a dichotomy. We keep on talking about India as a soft power. Now, can a soft power also be a nationalist power? Can a nationalist state think and talk and plan in terms of being a soft power? Because a soft power is not really A soft power is something for everybody. It is nothing for the nation really. So to be able to compete in the global market of jostling identities, we need to also consider whether we want to be a soft power, whether we want to be a hard power, whether we at all want to be a power or just limit ourselves to being what we are. So these are some of the questions which I think we need to we need to consider, and we need to look for answers because in this century, I don't think the received wisdom of the 19th or the 20th century concepts of nationalism really hold good.
Anand, to give his perspective, certainly on the definition and also on the other two, if you would like.
Thanks very much, Rajeev, and thank you, Mr. Ram Madhav and the India Foundation for having me here. My views are based on the thesis, which I shall elucidate in about 3 points, three brief points, and they may be right, they may be wrong. As Bertrand Russell famously said, I will not die for my beliefs, I might be wrong. My definition, my views stem from my definition of nationalism, and then I'll take it from there. So my definition of patriotism is that I love my country. My definition of nationalism is that I love my country. My country is the best country in the world. My people are the best people in the world. My tribe is the best people in the world. Everything about my country is the best in the world. And so that is my starting premise. Now, why do I think that nationalism, unfortunately, right now, as it stands today, is not only anti-science, it is anti-evolution, and it cannot withstand the passage of evolutionary time. And you may be surprised to know, but not only is nationalism anti-science, it is also anti-Hindu philosophy. And I'll explain that in about in the next 3 or 4 minutes. And it is a real tragedy that this word nationalism has really cropped up over the last 3 years, because according to me, everyone in the last 3 years, including the Prime Minister Modi, who's been saying I'm a nationalist, are actually patriots. They're not nationalists. Their belief system is based on Hindu philosophy, and the Hindu philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is the world is a family. Now, nationalism prohibits that. I'll explain that, why it does that. So when the Prime Minister, in fact, a lot of, as we've seen, political discourse and political narrative is very quickly picked up from the buzzwords that the Prime Minister utters from time to time. It is a misnomer. It's quite like a very famous Indian newspaper called The Hindu. I think about 3 or 4 years ago, during a rare interview of Prime Minister Modi, when he was asked, he said, yes, I am a Hindu, yes, I am a nationalist. And I think I can stem this rise of this word nationalism from there. Everyone jumped the gun and said, yes, I'm a nationalist too, I'm a nationalist. In effect, Prime Minister is a patriot, as I am, as a lot of people are, but not every Indian is. I'll come to that in a minute. But a lot of the right wing, a lot of the BJP people are actually patriots. Now, why do I say that? So let me begin my discourse by saying, why is nationalism anti-science? It is because it has been shown that diversity and improving diversity is the key to human evolution and human progress. And William Stemmer very famously did directed evolution, where in half a day in a test tube, he could actually, the more mutations you accumulate, the more diversity you generate in your genes, in your living cells, the better are your chances to survive. And that is what India is right now. That is what the globalized world means. That is what trade means. And nationalism is non-ideological. So we have nationalist countries, as we've seen throughout history. Right now, in fact, North Korea is stringently nationalist. We don't want to go there, because history has taught us that if you want to be exclusive, that would lead to the downfall in a very short term for your country, and it would prohibit evolution because it would restrict diversity. Now, North Korea, for example, you have a child who's suffering in North Korea, and North Korea says, we are the best country in the world. We are totally isolated because, we don't want anything to do with America, and America has the vaccine. How would that child get the vaccine? Science is a discipline which does not recognize nationalism, because any science that we do in India, any science that is done all over the world, is actually a collection of scientists who do not see themselves as nationalists. They see themselves as patriots because they want to do good for their country, but they don't work in an exclusive club because that is destructive. The other point about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam that I would like to make is that you see India right now, and when Kanchan said that, yes, Prime Minister Modi has been saying India first, of course, but are we really India first? Does India first mean that we would be absolutely exclusive? No. Look at the climate change agreement that India has agreed to. In fact, it is detrimental to us, because if we are exclusively looking for human progress, then for the next 30 years, we should be just having power generated through coal fields. We should not be going for nuclear power. We should not be going for environmentally friendly things that the West is capable of doing so. So we're losing out, and yet we believe that the world is a family. There are tens of other examples. There are examples where India is collaborating with theocratic states, with states that are not democracies. Why are we doing that? We just had an example of someone who came from a country which is not a democracy, and our country is very friendly with that. So to say that India first means that we have to be nationalist, personally, my view is that that's wrong. We are patriots. The reason why this nationalism of a lot of BJP, people in the BJP and the right wing, is they like to call themselves nationalists, is actually a defensive rhetoric against people who are anti-national. I use that word very carefully. So when someone says in my university, which is JNU, Bharat tere tukde honge, the immediate response is, oh, how dare you say that? My country is the best. I am a nationalist. No, you're a patriot. You can still hate what that person said about Bharat by being a patriot. There is nothing constructive that a nationalist can do that a patriot cannot do. Thanks very much.
Namaste. A lot of the points that I wanted to say sort of got covered by Rajeev ji and Kanchanda. I will speak a little bit about what I feel is the nationalist discourse, and then maybe give my response to some of the points that were raised by the earlier panelists. Rightly, as Kanchanda said, there is nationalism and there is patriotism. These are two distinct aspects, and we do need to understand it. Patriotism is more geographical. Somebody could move to UAE, UK, or US. In fact, even take their citizenship, which means that they would be patriotic to that country and to that flag, and yet retain a very strong Indicness within themselves, which is nationalism. When we look at the history of India, and when you look at the 2,000, 3,000 years history of India, it gave a lot, it grew a lot in terms of civilization, and then it went through a lot of marauding times where you had people coming from outside the country and looting and breaking down the civilization. Yet, in the 19th century, when we sort of, as a country, all the people in the country decided to fight against the British, at that point, it wasn't the patriotism that brought them together, it was the nationalism. The larger geographical Bharat survived despite the different rulers and the Britishers was because of the national identity or the nationalism. The nationalism was essentially about a growth. So which means that it being non-evolutionary is probably a wrong this, because the ethos of an Indian, the ethos of a Bharatiya person is always about self-realization and self-evolvement. And the nationalism comes from that point. So every person who believes in that is obviously nationalist. Patriotic, maybe whichever country he has a residentship, he's going to be patriotic towards that particular country. Nationalism is what the Jews sort of survived on till they were able to get their own country, because that identity and that Jewish nationalism was something that they believed in, and they survived a lot of atrocities until they were able to have their own country. When we talk about people paying their taxes, that is more or less being a civic-minded resident. Probably the problem is in India is the way the governance is done, that if you don't pay your taxes, or you can get away without paying your taxes, if you try doing that in UK, France, or US, you probably can't get away. Which is why the same Indian who does not want to pay taxes here, but still calls himself Indian, still says he is patriotic, would go and pay his taxes in the US. And that is probably because of the governance aspect, which again then is a different thing. It's not about nationalism or patriotism in itself. Coming to Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, what Anand mentioned, there is something very important about this phrase that needs to be clarified. A lot of people are unaware of this. I had fleetingly read this about 2 years back, and preparing for this panel, I sort of went back and read it up. Also had a good discussion with Professor Paranspe just during dinner on this particular aspect. I'm going to read the whole shloka, and I'm not familiar with it, so just bear with me. I'm going to read it from my phone. The complete shloka is Ayam nijaha paro veti ganana lagu chetasam udara charitanam tu vasudhaiva kutumbakam. This shloka appears not in any Upanishad, not in any Puranas as what the popular belief is, but it actually appears in Hitopadesha, which is the Panchatantras. And the story where this shloka appears is very interesting, and I'd like to tell you about it. There is a deer who's grazing in who's grazing grass, and a jackal comes along. The jackal wants to eat the deer, but he realizes that he may not be able to do so because the deer is a very swift animal. If he tries to catch hold of him, he will run away. So the jackal decides to do a thuggery. He makes friendship with the deer. He makes friendship with the deer, and that is where he recites this particular shloka. Udara charitanam tu vasudhaiva kutumbakam. He tells the deer, let's be friends, take me to your home. And I'm sort of paraphrasing over here. And then the deer obviously thinks, yes, the whole world is a family. I will take the jackal to my home. And they start walking. And there is a crow sitting on the tree who has seen this interaction and explains to the deer his mistake and saves the deer from the jackal. So actually the shloka is teaching us that we have to be careful of whom you invite in. It doesn't mean that you don't invite anyone, but it definitely means that you have to be careful of whom you invite in. So nationalism does not mean that everybody is a big, good, nice family. Because to live in a good, nice family, each one plays its own role, and each one has to play that role. What is the discourse that has to be there for today? Because I was talking in terms of in some sense, the past. Moving forward, there is going to be a lot of developments in terms of technology, in terms of infrastructure. We are going to evolve, and we are evolving. And in all of this, the nationalist discourse really should not change. You're using the technology to strengthen the discourse. That discourse which has always been about self-realization and humanity. It's only that you would have better technology to transfer those emotions in a better way to all the people. I'll end on that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm the last minute addition and I wasn't prepared for this. I was planning to have some fun and do some gossip with Mr. Anand Ranganathan, so I couldn't do it. Okay, I'm not, academically I don't know what is nationalism. Theoretically also I don't know. But when I was growing up, nobody even discussed secularism or nationalism. It's only in last 3 or 4 years, secularism in last 10, 15 years. And last 3, 4 years, wherever we go, we discuss nationalism, anti-nationalism. First of all, let me make it clear, I personally do not believe that anybody who lives in this country or any Indian who lives outside this country is anti-national or can ever be anti-national. Because if somebody holds an Indian passport and still he is an anti-national, then we are defeating the whole purpose of the national identity. To me, the whole debate about nationalism is about identity. This war which you are seeing in last 3, 4 years, which is going on, intellectual war, is about the identity. And last year I got a chance to travel all over the country by road. And we did some about 200,000, 2 lakh kilometers by road. And it took me to lots of villages and lots of people and we got to communicate. I think what has happened in India in last 2 decades since liberalization, if you see post-90s, before 90s if you remember, most of the brands which you bought were Indian. Almost all the food which you ate was Indian. Whichever state you went to had its own identity. People spoke different languages. Every state had an identity, but ultimately India per se had one collective identity. Wherever you went, I have nothing to do with religion, I mean don't misunderstand me, but wherever you went in the world, people said it's a country of Hindus. It's a Hindu nation. I studied in US, everybody called me, you come from Hindu nation. It's not that I am religious or I am anti-religion, but I am telling you that was more or less the identity of this country. And the great identity was that here is a nation which primarily is a Hindu nation, but it also has space for various religions and they believe in lots of things and people live cohesively, people live in harmony. Now suddenly what happened at some point of time, I don't know when, we introduced a word called secularism in this country, and which is not an Indian word. It's culturally, historically, secularism was invented in 2000 years ago, when Christianity had to spread all over Europe, and the state had a different religion, and that's when actually the word secularism was invented, which has nothing to do with India. When we started forcing foreign concepts in India, then the whole debate, people started feeling insecure that why these kind of concepts are being introduced. And then post-liberalization, what happened? That capitalism has a problem. Capitalism works basically on marketing. If you see, standardize everything. So that, and it's called, since I have practiced marketing all my life, to make things idiot-proof. So give one identity. If you go to US or Europe, you know exactly where the washroom is going to be, where the gas pump is going to be, where the malls and where the you know everything because so standardized. But India has always been a country, a diverse country, geographically, culturally, language-wise. You see the chaos, we find creativity in chaos. When the West was fighting and discovering the continent, geographical continents, we were discovering the continents of our soul. We were inward-looking people. We are a very different kind of people. We are a different country. But when we started making it standardized, we started making it look like any other country in the world, yes, we accept all religions, we are a secular country. We are not. We do not believe in the concept of tolerance. India is not about tolerance. India is about acceptance. Now, these are very deep-rooted, thousands and thousands of years. The mythology, the history, the cultural evolution, the invasion, the loots, everything, the British, it has created the self. Our cells carry that memory. Our memory is about accepting people, not tolerating people. That's why you will find when you go to US, the world's most diverse country, where you have people from all the countries of the world live there, but you will never find them interacting with each other. In India, can you spend even one day without interacting with people of different religions, different cultures, different faiths, different languages? Impossible. You can't. Your daily life depends on interacting with people of different languages, different kinds. But in US and Europe, you'll find there are colonies, all kinds of people live, but nobody interacts. There is no cultural exchange. So with globalization, with political, a kind of an ideological war, the middle class, small town, people living in villages, they started feeling insecure. And the problem in India was that in last 15, 20 years, the entire narrative was controlled by a set of people. And that's why you will find in 2014, when the government changed, and Mr. Modi, like you said, I am a Hindu, first time any leader stood. After Indira Gandhi, who used to wear Rudraksh and all those things, for the first time, a leader stood up and he said, yes, I am Hindu. And then all the suppressed voices, the voices which never got a platform, voices where people never cared about, 60, 70, 80% population of this country, Hindi speaking people, people coming from small towns, middle class, teacher ka beta, postman ka beta, they never ever found that identity was missing and they were insecure. And that's why you will find everybody is not talking about nationalism. I think it's more about the identity we believed in, the identity which is basically a part of our psyche. That is now finding a voice. And that is rattling everybody, and people are saying they are nationals and they are anti-nationals. I don't think anybody who eats khichdi can ever be anti-national. Why will he be anti-national? Or Mysore Pak for that matter. Why will he be anti-national? So, I think today the biggest challenge we have is, A, we must fight this standardization. We cannot have, some people can be secular, but the whole country cannot be secular. Today we were discussing in the afternoon, look at, in 1970s, during the emergency, our constitution was amended. Secular word, of course, it was added. Another word was added called socialist. And look at the irony, all the socialist leaders, all the socialist thinkers, all the socialist writers, intellectuals, professors, at that point were in jail. All the socialist thinkers were in jail and we amended socialism. Now that, at a larger level, if you see, if you'll keep telling 80% of the population of this country, it's not a Hindu country, it's a secular country, what does it mean? शर्मा जी का घर है, अगर सारे बच्चों को और फैमिली को बोला जाए कि भाई ये शर्मा जी का घर नहीं है, how would he feel? So I think the problem is creating false narratives. That is the biggest problem. It's not about nationalism or anti-nationalism. It's not that some people are anti-national. If somebody says, yes, I do not believe in religion, or somebody criticizes Hinduism, does not make him anti-national.
Vivek, thank you.
So just last thing, I don't know the time. I'll just conclude. All I want to say is that what we need to fight today is a false narrative. First, we have to accept, yes, we are primarily is a country of Hindu culture. We have to accept it. Whether you are Muslim or Christian or Jain or Buddhist, it's a Hindu cultural identity which we take pride in, we believe in, and I think that is what is nationalism to me.
So I would like to take an opportunity to respond to some of the things that were mentioned. Let me start with Kanchan. See, I think you make a false dichotomy when you label Indians living abroad as long-distance nationalists. I think it's extremely unfair, partly because I was one. You know, I lived abroad and I felt very nationalistic there as well as here. You'll have your opportunity to respond in a minute. Let me finish my pitch. Part of it is that, you know, wherever you go, you are immediately identifiable, right? Nobody has any doubt as to who you are. You are an Indian, right? And secondly, the fact that you're an Indian grows on you. When you live abroad for a while, you start wondering what it is that attracts you back to the country that Indian exceptionalism part that I was talking about. Because India is exceptional, and that's my objection to what you were saying, Anand. You are talking about, in a way, this generic, Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, everybody is the same. But that may or may not be absolutely correct in a technical, scientific sense. For example, I can tell you with certainty that Indian cows are not the same as Western cows, right? You got Bos indicus, which is quite different from Bos taurus. Similarly, I think there is something in the Indian constitution, I mean the physical constitution of Indians, the geography, the culture, the geology, all those things have conspired to make us different. And secondly, even if there isn't a difference, right, physically, it's important for us to psychologically believe there is a difference, which is what has made different countries stand up. And this goes back to what I said about C.K. Prahalad. You know, you have a dream, as Martin Luther King said, or C.K. Prahalad's idea was of a strategic intent, where you figure out where you're going to be. And to get to that point, you have to believe you're better than others. Okay, you have to believe yours is, in a way, the chosen country, the chosen people. You talked about Jews. How did they survive for millennia? They knew, or at least they believed they were the chosen people. Why do the Chinese do so well? Why have they risen so fast, so quickly? They believe they're better. And if we go by and say, well, we're also kind of okay, we're almost as good. No, that's not going to get us anywhere. We have to believe that we are, you know, first among equals, maybe. We don't have to be aggressive about it, but unless you have a certain strong feeling of superiority, and let me put it bluntly, we have to believe we're superior, or else we're going to be also rands. And the second thing I wanted to respond to was, I really appreciated what you were saying, Yogini, about the fullness of that quotation. In other words, this quotation that we've been fed for some time really is exactly the opposite. The Panchatantra is quoting that quotation to tell you, do not believe that the whole world is one, because that's the road to perdition. And then, Vivek, I appreciate what he said about the collective identity that we see in India despite the differences, because I used to find it, I don't speak Hindi very well, so if I travel around India, I can hardly understand what people are saying in many places, but I still feel as part of that. Whereas when I was in America, wherever I went, I understood everything people were saying, but I did not feel part of it. It's a feeling, it's something that you intensely believe in, and that's what I think nationalism is. And it's not I see the distinction you're making between patriotism and nationalism. I think nationalism is a far more intense, personal thing. And there is this book called Under Two Flags. And I felt that way when I was living in America. I was literally living under two flags. I had an Indian flag in my head, and outside my door I had to have an American flag. And most of us who have lived abroad for a long time see that at the end of the day, unless you make a gargantuan effort, you're going to still be an Indian national. So that is where that evolution comes to many people who have spent some time abroad. Now let me ask Saresh to respond. You had some comments?
I feel that if we start believing that not paying taxes, looting banks, not obeying the laws of the country is a civic issue, then God help the country. I mean, this is the core on which we are what we have been today, because if you do away with all this, then whole nationalism is hollowness. Fundamentally, patriotism is fundamental for me. You cannot be a nationalist if you are not patriot. And you cannot be a patriot if you loot the country. So this will all become hollow, and it would be dangerous precedent if we start giving nationalist certificates to people who loot the country, people who loot the banks, people who don't pay taxes, don't obey the laws of the land. And if you start bringing the 2000 years, 3000 years, of course, it is. But presently what we are, if we don't do that, then everything about the belief of nationalism is hollow. And about your Ummah thing, I would say one thing, that this is the most misplaced concept. I remember, if we go back in the history, immediately after partition, I think somewhere 4 months or 5 months after that, Moulana Azad gave a speech on the Precinct of Jama Masjid. And it's one of the classics of Moulana Azad, because people from Bihar and everybody were moving towards Pakistan, and they used to pass through Delhi and they used to take halt in Jama Masjid. And he used to say, and that is classic, ये हौज जो हौज थी जिसमें वुजू बनाते हैं नमाज पढ़ने के लिए, ये हौज तुमको पुकारती है, कहाँ जा रहे हो तुम, ये तुम्हारा मुल्क है, कहाँ जा रहे हो. That everybody has to read that, of 1947. He said one thing at that point of time, because Pakistan had become West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Moulana Azad said that after the 4th Khalif, Hazrat Ali, no Islamic Khalif has binded the Muslims together in the name of religion. Culture, language and ethnicity was a bigger binder than religion. And he said this, that Pakistan, East Pakistan will not remain with West Pakistan. That was Moulana Azad said in 1947. And I saw this, I couldn't believe till I went to England. I lived in England for 7 years and I couldn't believe that. You have to go to see to believe it. In England, there are 3 types of Indians from the subcontinent. You have Indians from Gujarat, essentially, more Muslims also, Gujarati Muslims and Hindu Muslims. Then you have Bengalis, Bengali Hindus and Bangladeshi Muslims. And you have Punjabis, the Punjabi Muslims and the Punjabi Christians. The Gujarati Muslim goes with the Gujarati Hindu. And Bengali Hindu goes with a Bengali Muslim. And Sikhs go with the Punjabi. There is no connection between the Indian Muslims and the Pakistanis. In fact, I know one city in England which is supposed to be the highest Pakistanis outside Pakistan, that is Bradford. Bradford is one city or one place where you have maximum Pakistanis outside Pakistan. Now, just 5 kilometers from Bradford is a town called Dewsbury. In Bradford, you will not find a single Indian Muslim. And in Dewsbury, you will not find a single Pakistani Muslim. There are different mosques for Pakistanis, different graveyards. So I feel that nationalism is much beyond religion, and the binding for any nationalist is culture, language and the ethnicity. But again I'll repeat that if we don't obey the laws of the land, we are not honest taxpayers, we loot the banks, then anything about nationalism is hollowness. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it sounds very nice to talk about England, but most of England is now Dhimmi land. Very little of England, as at least some of us knew it, exists today. So let's not start looking at England as an example. We have, and also the other thing which I've often it really bothers me. We from the subcontinent. That is the worst sanitization that has taken place in history. What subcontinent? There was the Indian subcontinent. When you remove the word Indian and you just make it the subcontinent, and that is where you strike at the heart of the Indian national identity. I am an Indian. I won't say that I am a subcontinentalist. I am an Indian. Ummah. Of course, the idea of a ummahhood is a bothersome idea. I remember there was this famous spat which Sayyid Shahabuddin had. He would never say Indian Muslim, he would say Muslim Indian. And he would say Muslim Indian because he would say that the Muslim identity is bigger than the Indian identity. And even today, I accept this as my motherland. My idea of nationhood, my idea of national identity, my idea of nationalism is rooted in the land. This is my holy land. This is a land I worship. You can call it Pitribhu, you can call it Matribhu. But it is holy land for me. Would a Muslim accept that this is the holiest of holy lands for him or for her? A Hindu would do that. And without that kind of a deep spiritual connect, you really cannot feel the basic urge of a nationalist identity, or the basic urge of nationalism. Rajeev, and about taxes, let's not confuse taxes with nationalism. If I were to be living in America, I would pay up all my taxes dutifully, just as I pay up in India. But that won't make me an American. I would still remain an Indian. You talked about long distance nationalism. It was not a disparaging comment. I meant it quite seriously that we have a huge and we have an expanding diaspora. An Indian who moves out today would and sees himself as a global citizen also believes in the idea of India, sees himself as an Indian essentially. So there is the nationalist surge in him also. Now that pulse needs to be recognized, and how we reframe the concept of nationalism for the 21st century is important. Vivek made a mention of all socialists being in jail during the emergency. He is right technically, but the idea of socialist, the word socialist was incorporated at the behest of the CPI, the Communist Party of India, which was in reverse the running dog of the USSR, and the word socialist was borrowed from there. So that really didn't make much of a difference whether they were in jail or free. Now look, language can be critical to the idea of nationhood. And again, this flows from the European concept of nationalism, where they had to first invent a nation, then a national identity, and then create a sense of nationalism. So their language played a key role. So if you were talking about German nationalism, you had German language. If you were talking about French nationalism, you had the French language, and it went on, English nationalism, English language. But to transpose that idea in India, I don't think is going to work. There was this slogan of Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. But Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan is a very limited, the scope of applying that concept is very limited, and it's not going to work on a pan-Indian level. Also this whole, just a last point, this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, this is one of those great, and I don't really mean it very seriously, but another of those great Nehruvian hoaxes, where you take a half story and you sell it as a full story, and the world is one big family, because Mr. Nehru had this grand vision of himself as the leader of the free world. In real life, it didn't work that way. You know, you also had Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. They came and trampled you, didn't they?
No, I'll just add. Sayyid Shahabuddin does not represent the Muslims. It is Sayyid Shahabuddin's way of putting Muslims India. We don't say Muslims India. We say Indian Muslims. And millions of Muslims in the country say Indian Muslims. That was Mr. Shahabuddin's idea, and you know what? He went into oblivion. Second, about Ummah. Because everybody in the Saudi world, in the Arab world, is identified as Saudi, Qatari, Kuwaiti, Emirati. If they would have been all one, they have same language, same religion, but they are different. So the identity of ethnicity is very important.
The reason I brought that up, Zaresh, is because both the church and the Ummah, as I see it at least, have an internationalist perspective. They may have a national identity, but there is an overriding superordinate, sense of belonging that both talk about.
It is a recent one started by the this Wahhabi movement which came up, because this thing as about Ummah was alien to us. I mean, I didn't know about this till I went outside India. So this had nothing to do with, of course, I don't use the word subcontinent. I use the whole segment. This was never there. It is an import, but only when the petrodollars were coming in full swing, it was there, but that effect is diminishing, and it is slowly diminished to that level.
But it's still there. It is a fact today.
In some quarters, but you can't generalize.
Ummah is basically the nation of Islam, right? Now, when you talk of the larger nation of Islam, you can at best have Islamic states. So what you have are Islamic states, but you do not have Islamic nation states. And what existed as Islamic states were largely Westphalian states that were created by drawing on a map with a pencil after the First War, the Sykes-Picot line. So the concept of an Islamic nation state is a contradiction in terms. It cannot coexist. You cannot have Islam and a nation state coexisting at the same time. Now, this is not to pass a value judgment, but to say that, when Pakistan was happening, one of the biggest, one of the strongest stands against that, against partition was taken by the Jamaat. The Jamaat said, horrors, what is this happening? How can you take a small piece of land and make that into a land of Islam? All of this, the entire subcontinent, as people say, is the land of Islam. So, to pick up stray voices, this is like quoting Jinnah after so much bloodshed, after so much death, after so much horror, to say everybody is free to go to his place of worship, and therefore Pakistan was supposed to be some great secular state. That's hogwash.
No, you are mistaken. Majority of the Muslims, Jamaat is a very small portion. If you are mistaken, it's a minority of minority, Jamaat-e-Islami. Even today it hardly exists. Now if Jamaat says something and you prescribe that to the Muslims of India is disservice to the Muslims.
Let me cut.
Muslims of India never accepted this theory of Jamaat. It was rejected. And Jamaat has always been a minority of minority.
Nationalism is destructive. It is something that you cannot beat the passage of evolutionary time. You cannot beat science. It is exclusive. It is being tribal. It is being superior. It is a bit like, well, you can say all of us are Parsis. Some are more Parsis, some are less Parsis, and some are actual Parsis. But will the Parsis be able to survive the passage of evolutionary time? I don't think so, unless they mix. That is one example. And let me just come to a couple of points, because Yogini made that comment about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and Dada said that is Nehruvian hoax. Believe me, I am the one who's currently tabulating all the Nehruvian hoaxes, so I would probably know. And there have been a lot of Nehruvian hoaxes. I don't know whether it is a Nehruvian hoax or not, but let's say common sense dictates that if a tiger tells or a wolf tells a deer that, come on, we are a part of a family, and if the deer believes it, then the deer is being nonsensical, because traditionally the wolf or the tiger eats the deer. But if a black buck comes and talks to a deer and says, look, we have 99.99% DNA that is identical, we are a brotherhood, we are a family, which is what we humans are, then it's a different comparison to what making of wolf and deer. let me again come to that. Even if that Vasudeva Kutumbakam was taken in that context, I dare say that our civilization, you can call it a Hindu civilization, all right, our civilization has actually over thousands of years actually practiced that, has practiced that even last century. What do I mean by that? We were the only country that gave refuge to Dalai Lama. We need not have. We in fact soured our relations with a big country, but we said, okay, we'll stand for what is right. The world is a family. In 1950, South Africa was the 7th most prosperous economy in the world. But we decided, no, they are being racist. It's an apartheid state. We will have nothing to do with South Africa. England, America cut off relations with South Africa in 1972. We did much before that. We suffered economically. But no, we stood for what is right. We stood for what the world is a family. The final point I like to make as far as what Vivek said about there is nothing called anti-national. I'm sorry, Vivek, I disagree with you. You know, we can have various podiums to do virtue signaling, but this is not one. Of course, there are anti-nationals. Of course, there are. And what do I mean by that? I mean, starting from JNU itself. But to come to the broader point of what you raised, I think darna nahi hai, okay? If you want to have a discussion which is objective, then let's not be afraid of saying what the truth is. And the truth is that when I see the right wing right now on this defensive rhetoric of I'm a nationalist, I see them as patriots who confuse between what is nationalism and this. What I see true nationalists, exclusive, superior, tribal, are actually is nothing but pan-communism and pan-Islamism, okay? We have to be honest about it. And let me just finally just read something from someone who's respected a lot, but of course people are so fearful of what he said. According to me, perhaps in the last 60, 70 years, the only liberal we've had. Incidentally, before I quote that, can I also raise a point which Professor Sareshwala raised, saying that you have Indian Muslims who weren't interacting with Pakistani Muslims but others. When it came to burning Salman Rushdie's books, all the Indian Muslims, Pakistani Muslims and Bangladeshi Muslims came together in Bradford and burnt it. So there is something to be about pan-Islamism. Now, this is what someone said. Islam is a closed corporation, and the distinction that it makes between Muslims and non-Muslims is very real, very positive and very alienating distinction. The brotherhood of Islam is not the universal brotherhood of man. It is the brotherhood of Muslims for Muslims only. There is fraternity, but its benefit is confined to those within that corporation. For those who are outside the corporation, there is nothing but contempt and enmity. Who said this? Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Okay? So let's be honest about it. Let us accept that there is a system called pan-Islamism. There is a cult called pan-communism, and this is what real nationalism is. This is not Hinduism. This is exclusivity. Let us not confuse the two. That's all I like to say. Thank you.
Since we've been having a discussion more from a religion standpoint than a country standpoint, I'll try and get back this to this country because, like we said, nationalism is about being Indian. And yes, we all are coming from different religions, different varnas or different this. We have survived as a civilization for a very, very long time. In fact, we're probably one of the longest surviving civilizations. We have a city called Banaras, which is one of the oldest living cities in the world. Unfortunately, when you go to MIT and take a course in building cities, and I did that course, and funnily enough, nobody mentions Banaras, even though it's one of the oldest surviving cities and continuing to evolve. So again, nationalism is not anti-evolution, I do not believe. Today, Banaras has been the center of cultural evolution, of spiritual evolution for India, and is the place where a lot of us would want to go. And irrespective of your religion, probably you would want to go. In India, we have had Muslims who have continued to evolve and revive the Indic culture. Today's example I would give is of the Dagar brothers, who are upholding the Drupad tradition. What definitely is something that I have noticed whenever I have attended a Drupad recital is that the number of Muslims who attend a Drupad recital versus the number of non-Hindus who attend it are larger. Maybe that is something that needs to be looked into and ensured that everybody is looking at developing our culture, because that cultural identity is what will make us survive eventually and what will make us evolve. I wouldn't say we are the greatest, but we can aim to be the greatest.
Thank you, Anand, for raising that issue, okay? When I was saying I do not believe that people are actually anti-national, what I meant was that on social media and everywhere people say, this guy is an anti-national. Your favorite journalists, some of them, people say he's an anti-national. I don't want to believe that they're anti-nationals. Because to me, nationalism is a feeling of an identity. But we have a problem here. And while you asked me this question, I've been thinking how this nationalist and anti-nationalist discourse starts. I'm a filmmaker, I'll give you an example. You look at Indian movies, Hindi cinema in last 10-15 years, right? We have made lots of, in fact, Raj Kapoor, Guru Dutt, all these people were leftists. They were hardcore communists. They came from IPTA and they followed that tradition. And they, if you look at the movies, they were pro-poor, anti-rich, showing rich people always in bad light, showing poor people as nice, kind, honest person, not truth, but still a false narrative was created. But in 10-15 years, what has happened? There is a movie, I'll give you as a metaphorical example, there's a movie called Heather. In that movie, people go in Kashmir, in a Hindu temple, and they sing a song called Bismillah, Bismillah. All the imagery which is shown is a non-Hindu. In fact, in creativity, it's called an anti-thought. Anti-thought is like, I make a movie called Antichrist, or I make a thing called Sexy Durga. You know, this is like to provoke, to incite, so that, yes. Now, that is a false, and then people say, oh my God, it's a very beautiful film, it's a creative. Look at this director, look at this writer, look at this filmmaker. He can go to a Indian Hindu temple and he can sing a song called Bismillah. Now the problem starts when you start challenging one identity, you start questioning and diluting one identity. Can you do the reverse? This is the question I've been asking myself and I've been asking in every forum. Can you do the reverse? Today, if I make a film where I go to a mosque, I'm asking Zafar Bhai, if I go to a mosque and I sing a song there, Jai Shri Ram, Jai Shri Ram, will I also get a national award? If I am not getting a national award for that, because then people say you are communal, tum to sangi ho, then the problem begins. Then I think the question should come, what kind of definition we are willing to accept of nationalism and anti-nationalism. You know what I mean? So it's all about a feeling. If we start accepting these things, the result being that in Hindi cinema, in our television, in our newspapers, in the media, the narrative where narrative is created, you will find there is no Indianness left. When was the last time in any Hindi movie you saw people sitting eating Indian food except for Punjabi food? If that is Indian, then it's fine. If Bhangra is Indian, then it is fine. When was the last time you saw that the characters are from all parts of the country? They used to be. Not anymore. Our hero is always in London and New York. So the problem is we have taken Indianness out of all the narrative. And we try to create this secular, we started justifying secular. I think that is anti-national. That false narrative of not celebrating which is Indian, not celebrating, not giving space to a Hindi-speaking, Marathi-speaking middle-class boy and girl, and giving a lot of space to these intellectual, academic, English-speaking people, which is an un-Indian thought. I think that is the biggest challenge and threat. Every time you see a movie, see whether this represents India. Every American movie you see, Every single American movie represents American values, their family, their culture, their lifestyle, their clothing, their everything, their architecture. They're so proud of showing their architecture in their movies. We don't do that. And we think people who do not do it are seculars and therefore they are creative, therefore they are intellectual. And for last 15 years we have celebrated fake, false, creative people like that. I think that has been the biggest threat to Indian nationalism.
Here's one. This should appear on the screen. Is it on the screen? Yeah, okay. But in an era of globalization, growing concern for nationalist approach, how to balance nation's interest at par with world interest? Anybody want to attempt to answer that?
So this is one of the challenges of the 21st century, that you have globalism and you have nationalism. And it's not only we in India that are facing this challenge. The Chinese are facing it, the Russians are facing it, the Americans are facing it. And each one of them is coping with it by aggressively pushing the national identity. So the national identity, when we say India first, what do we mean? We mean the Indian identity first. And India's interests first. And if you can convincingly push these two things, then I think you can deal with the conflict between globalism and nationalism. And it's a conflict that is just about surfacing and will only get increasingly intense in the coming years, as will the conflict between the Indian identity, the European identity, the American identity, the Russian identity, and the Chinese identity. So it's a big fight that is coming up now.
Look, there's been a lot of discussion about national identity, and Kanchan just spoke about it. The question that we all must ask, and I don't think anyone's actually talking about it, is that what is the Indian identity about? I mean, if you go to America, they're very clear about who they are. They are white, Protestants. Their first allegiance is to the Constitution and the flag. And that's what keeps the American identity going. And then you can be an American Indian, an American Chinese, or whatever else. But essentially, they have defined who they are. But in the Indian context, there is no such definition. And I think that's what creates the confusion that we have today. I mean, we are a Hindu or a Muslim or a Bihari or a UPite first, and then we are whatever. But what is that Indian identity? Is there a definition like America has one?
I'd like to answer that if I may. Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And the answer to that is that the lack of definition is actually the definition.
Brilliant.
All right?
Very nice.
And thank you for asking that, because history shows us that cultures that are not very ancient, I mean, there is more culture in a pot of yogurt than in America, but having said that, you talk of recent cultures, you talk of recent religions, they are the ones who are constantly pining for superiority, exclusivity. You have a nation, India, or a culture that has started 8,000 years. There is a tahrav. There is a tahrav and there is an understatedness. And that is refinement. The lack of definition is the definition itself, and that is the greatness. Let us accept it. Let us not go for exclusivity. Let's go for oneness.
Yeah, just a brief intervention. I think there is a definition. Amit, you say that the American knows who he is. That's because they had to invent a national identity. They had to invent the idea of who they are. We don't need to invent it because we know where we are coming from. Anand uses the word culture, but I would use the word civilization. We have what the Americans don't have. We have a civilizational identity. And it is that civilizational identity which gives us our basic national identity. So it's wrong to say that we do not have an identity or we do not have a definition. Of course we have a definition. I am an Indian because I come and I belong to the great Indian civilization. It's a timeless thing. I mean, and this is something which an American cannot claim to have.
I'd like to disagree with Anand on this, because I think not having a definition, and you're a scientist, right? You never accept anything that doesn't have a proper definition. Not having a definition is a great mistake. You see this in this whole question about Hinduism. Is it a religion or is it a way of life? Nobody knows. And what's the result of that? Religions have certain privileges. Wherever you go in the world, a religion has the right to do A, B, C, and D. Nowhere in the world does a way of life has any kind of privilege. That means we're losing out. Another example is this great strategic ambiguity we had about whether or not we had a nuclear weapon, right? What did that buy us? Absolutely nothing. So it's nice to delude ourselves that by being ambiguous, we're somehow virtuous or we're doing something that's wonderful. And it's
I was not hinting at ambiguity when I was saying that. I was thinking at understatedness, not saying it, but understanding it. And that is what actually leads to, if I can be blunt, I cannot think of any other religion or way of life that will actually reform. Why do things reform? Is because there is nothing stringent about them. They are willing to adapt, to take mutations, just to draw a scientific parallel. So it is not ambiguous when I say that there is no definition of it. I think after a lot of thinking, out of maybe thousands of years of thinking, we've come to this thing that we do not need to define it. It's just in us.
Just one thing I was saying in his support, why you cannot define.
You are supporting me, or
you're supporting you. Very quickly,
for a change.
You can't define what Indianism or Hinduism word I refrain using these days. What it's about. I think the best metaphor for that is Shiva's Tandav Nritya, the cosmic dance. That everything about India can be defined in that. It says like quantas, like atom. When I'm there, I'm not there. When I'm not there, I'm there. When I'm static, I'm dynamic. When I'm dynamic, I'm static. You understand as a scientist? So I think what it's trying to say is India is Ram also, India is Ravan also. So you cannot define India so easily.
So let me thank the organizers as well as the panelists for a rather vigorous discussion. Thank you very much.